$142,500 vanished stolen by my own brother and his criminal girlfriend. I thought I'd lost everything until my 12-year-old son walked in, calmly slid the thief's phone across the table and said, "Dad, don't worry, I handled it." But that wasn't a rescue. It was the start of a much darker nightmare. The humid Naples air felt static, frozen by the sight of my empty vault. Years of sweat, my retirement, and Leo's college fund had been siphoned into the void. I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the rectangular dust marks on the wall where our family portraits used to hang. Caleb hadn't just taken the cash, he'd taken the history. He knew the biometric bypass for my secondary accounts code I thought was a sacred bond between brothers. Now, that bond was a liability. Outside, the Florida sun bleached the pavement white, but inside the shadows felt like they were closing in. I could hear the hum of the air conditioner, a mechanical heartbeat in a house that suddenly felt like a tomb. I was a man ruined by his own blood, standing in $1 million home that I no longer owned. The silence was absolute, heavy with the realization that my own brother had calculated my destruction down to the last cent. Every drawer was tossed, every memory ransacked. He didn't just leave, he erased us. I was staring at a forged withdrawal slip when the floorboards creaked behind me. I expected the police, I expected the end. I didn't expect the chilling composure of a child who had seen too much. The $142,500 wasn't just a number, it was the price of every lie Caleb had ever told me. Each dollar represented a memory I had to burn. As I looked at the empty safe, I realized the theft began long before today. It began with every loan I never asked back, for every excuse I made for his failures. The betrayal tasted like iron in my mouth, sharp and unnatural. I wanted to scream, to tear the walls down, but my limbs felt like lead. The vacuum of the room seemed to suck the oxygen out of my lungs. My brother, the man I taught to ride a bike, the man I bailed out of trouble a dozen times, had finally delivered the killing blow. And he did it with a smile, leaving behind nothing but the cold, clinical evidence of his greed. I was a ghost in my own hallway, haunted by the digital trail of my own ruin. The $142,500 was gone, and with it the man I used to be. I was no longer a provider. I was a victim of my own misplaced loyalty. The silence grew until it was deafening, a roar of failure that filled my ears. Then the door opened, and the world shifted on its axis. Caleb wasn't just my brother. He was a master of the long con, a skill he'd apparently perfected while I was busy building a life he felt entitled to steal. He had always been the charming disaster of the Thorne family, the one who could talk his way out of a burning building while holding the matches. But this time he wasn't alone. Skylar "Sky" Vane was the accelerant. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at a crumpled receipt ID found in the guest room where they'd stayed. It was for a high-end burner phone purchased 3 weeks ago. They hadn't just snapped. They had been nesting in my home, mapping my routines like urban predators. Sky was a ghost in the digital world, a woman with 3 different social security numbers and a trail of accidental fires in her wake from Seattle to Miami. She didn't just love Caleb, she managed him. I remembered the way she'd looked at my mother's diamond ring during dinner last Sunday, her eyes tracking the light like a hawk. Today, that ring was gone. I found the velvet box in the trash can behind the garage, emptied and discarded like a piece of fruit. Caleb had pried the stone out a 3-carat family heirloom and left the gold setting behind as if it were worthless scrap. The cruelty of it was a physical weight. He knew that ring was the only thing I had left of Mom, a promise that our family's legacy would continue. To him, it was just a down payment on a getaway car. I scrolled through my old texts with him, seeing the "I love you, bro," and the "thanks for having our back" messages. They were lures. Every meal I'd cooked for them, every bottle of wine we'd shared on the patio was an interrogation. They were looking for the gap in my armor, and they found it in my trust. Caleb had even mimicked my speech patterns to bypass the bank's voice recognition security, a trick we used to play as kids to prank our parents. Now that childhood game had cost me $142,500. I looked at a photo of us from 10 years ago hiking in the Smokies. Caleb's arm was around my shoulder, his smile wide and infectious. I realized then that the man in that photo was a fiction, a character he played to keep the bank of Elias Thorne open for business. He didn't see a brother. He saw a mark. Sky had convinced him that I was the lucky one who didn't deserve my success, turning his lifelong insecurity into a weaponized resentment. They were heading for the Keys, likely Isla Morada, where Sky's associates ran a boat charter that didn't ask questions. I could almost see them in a rental SUV, Sky's hand on his knee, laughing at how easy it had been to break me. They had traded 30 years of brotherhood for a bag of cash and a stone that didn't belong to them. The air in the house smelled of Sky's heavy vanilla perfume scent that now felt like a toxic gas. I wanted to hunt them down, to feel my hands around Caleb's throat until he admitted he was a coward. But the deeper I looked into the wreckage they left, the more I realized they had planned for my anger. They expected me to call the police to file a report to be the predictable victim. What they didn't account for was the quiet observer who had been watching them from the hallway for the last 3 weeks. My son Leo had been a ghost in his own home, silent and invisible while the predators circled. He had seen the whispers in the kitchen at 2:00 a.m. He had seen Sky tampering with my laptop while I was in the shower. While I was blinded by loyalty, Leo was collecting data. He didn't see an uncle. He saw a threat to his father. And in the Thorne house, a threat to the family was a problem that required a permanent solution. I looked at the empty space on the dresser and felt a cold, hard clarity replace my grief. Caleb had taken the money, but he had left behind something far more dangerous, a son who no longer believed in forgiveness. The betrayal was complete, the lines were drawn, and the hunt was no longer mine to lead. Leo stepped into the kitchen, his shadow stretching long and thin across the marble floor. He didn't look like a boy who had just watched his father's life collapse. He looked like a professional who had just finished a long day at the office. In his hand he held a black smartphone, not his own, but the sleek, titanium-cased device I recognized as Skylar's. The eerie calm Declan had mentioned in the original story was here, but in Leo it felt more like a calculated frequency. "Dad, it's done," he said, his voice dropping an octave devoid of the usual adolescent crack. He placed the phone on the table with a clinical precision, centering it perfectly between us. The screen flickered to life, displaying a cascade of 42 missed calls from a blocked number in Isla Morada. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. "How did you get that, Leo?" I whispered, my voice a thin reed. He didn't blink. He pulled out a chair and sat down, his posture straighter than I'd ever seen it. She left it charging in the guest suite while they were loading the SUV. She thought she was being careful using a VPN, but she plugged it into the house Wi-Fi once. That was all I needed. He began to explain the technical execution with the detachment of a surgeon describing a routine gallbladder removal. He hadn't just guessed a password. He had cloned her SIM card using a kit I'd ordered off a gray market site months ago, just in case. While I was hosting barbecues and playing the part of the hospitable older brother, my 12-year-old son was running a localized surveillance operation. He had installed a keylogger on the guest suite's smart TV, capturing every login Sky and Caleb made to their offshore accounts. "They thought they were ghosts, Dad, but ghosts still leave digital footprints." He slid the phone toward me, revealing a folder labeled Evidence. Oh, inside were high-resolution photos of my mother's diamond ring being appraised at a pawn shop in Naples, time-stamped and geotagged. There were voice recordings of Sky whispering to Caleb about how they would bleed Elias dry before heading to the Bahamas. Hearing my brother's laugh on the recording, that familiar boisterous laugh I'd loved since childhood, felt like a physical blow to my stomach. But Leo didn't flinch. He watched me with eyes that seemed to be measuring my reaction, soul-searching for a weakness he might need to correct. The metallic scent of the room, the sharp tang of ozone from his laptop filled the air. Leo wasn't crying. He wasn't scared. He was waiting for me to catch up to the reality he had already mastered. "I didn't just track them, Dad. I broke them." He showed me a series of outgoing messages sent from Sky's phone to her associates in the Keys messages Leo had authored. He had started a war between them and their handlers, making it look like Sky was skimming off the top of their shared cut. He had turned the predators into prey before they even hit the highway. I looked at my son, the boy I had taken to Disney World just last summer, and felt a coldness crawl along my spine. This wasn't a child seeking justice. This was a strategist executing a maneuver. The $142,500 was no longer the most important thing in the room. The most important thing was the realization that my son had stepped into a world of shadows, and he had done it without breaking a sweat. He wasn't a victim, he was the conductor. And as he sat there bathed in the blue light of the stolen screen, I realized that the son I thought I knew had vanished along with the money, replaced by someone far more capable and far more terrifying. "Don't be sad, Dad," he said, a small, practiced smile touching his lips. "They made a move. I just finished the game." The silence that followed was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Leo reached for his glass of milk, his hand steady, while mine shook so hard I had to hide it under the table. He was 12. He was my son, and he had just dismantled a criminal operation before lunchtime. The horror wasn't in the crime, it was in the cure. I realized then that while Caleb had stolen my past, Leo had just claimed the future, and I wasn't sure I was invited to be a part of it anymore. He was 3 steps ahead of the world and light years ahead of me. The boy who loved pancakes was gone. The architect had arrived. Leo opened his laptop, the screen illuminating his face in a ghostly pale glow that made him look older than any 12-year-old should. He didn't use a standard browser. He navigated through a series of command line interfaces and encrypted partitions with a terrifying fluid muscle memory. "I didn't just guess their destination, Dad. I've been inside Sky's digital life for 16 days. He murmured, his fingers dancing across the mechanical keyboard with a rhythmic, percussive sound that echoed in the silent kitchen. He showed me a map of the Florida coastline, dotted with red pings that pulsed like a digital heartbeat. He had used a customized Python script to intercept the Bluetooth handshakes from Caleb's rental SUV, cross-referencing them with public traffic cameras along I-75 and the Alligator Alley. While I was grieving the loss of my brother's loyalty and staring at empty walls, Leo was running a sophisticated signals intelligence operation from his bedroom right under my nose. He explained how he discovered Sky's Burn Foldera collection of identity documents, forged passports, and offshore routing numbers stored in a hidden encrypted partition of her cloud drive. She thought a 16-character password would stop me. She used her first arrest date plus her dog's name. It took me 4 minutes to run a brute force dictionary attack based on her social media history. He spoke of phishing and social engineering as if they were simple middle school electives, mundane and easy. He had sent a spoofed email from the bank's fraud prevention department to Caleb's burner phone, tricking him into verifying his location at a specific gas station in Florida City. That single greedy click had given Leo full GPS access and mirrored the phone's entire file system. There at a bait shop near Isla Morada, right now sitting in a black Tahoe waiting for a boat that's never coming, Leo said, his eyes reflecting the infinite lines of scrolling green code. I canceled the private charter using the captain's own encrypted messaging app. I told the captain the package was compromised by the feds and that the payment was being clawed back. The captain didn't ask questions. He just turned his transponder off and headed back to Marathon. I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of fatherly awe and a deep, visceral dread. This wasn't a child playing detective or a boy mimicking a movie. This was an apex predator systematically dismantling a target. He had isolated them in the middle of the Keys, cut off their only escape route to the Caribbean, and drained Sky's backup crypto wallets into an untraceable, cold storage device currently sitting in his desk drawer next to his comic books. The technical prowess was staggering, but it was his emotional detachment that chilled me to the bone. He talked about his Uncle Caleb, the man who had bought him his first baseball glove and taught him how to throw a curveball as a variable that had been neutralized because it had become a liability to the household's stability. Information isn't just data, Dad, it's leverage. It's the only currency that matters in a world where everyone is lying. They thought they were the ones with the power because they had the physical cash in a duffel bag. They didn't realize I had the digital keys to every door. They tried to open every account they tried to hide and every dream they tried to buy with your money. He showed me the internal bank logs he'd intercepted by exploiting a vulnerability in the bank's legacy API. He proved that a low-level personal banker in Naples had been providing Caleb with my bypass codes and biometric overrides in exchange for a 20% cut of the loot. Leo had already compiled a comprehensive dossier on that clerk, including browser history and IP logs, and sent it to the bank's chief compliance officer from an anonymous multi-layered Proton Mail account. He was cleaning house, purging every person who had touched our family's security, leaving no stone unturned. The $142,500 was sitting in a digital limbo, a series of bits and bytes waiting for Leo's final command to return to a safe harbor. As he closed the laptop lid with a soft click, the sudden darkness in the room felt heavier, almost suffocating. He wasn't looking for a good job, a thank you, or a hug from his father. He was looking at me with a steady, unblinking gaze, waiting to see if I had the stomach for the next phase of the operation. He had mapped their movements, intercepted their every communication, and paralyzed their finances with the surgical precision of a shadow government agency. In the quiet of the kitchen, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock, marking the seconds of my son's final transition from a child to something much more formidable. He had mastered a world I barely understood, a world of backdoors and zero-day exploits, and he had done it all to protect a version of me that he clearly thought was too naive to protect itself. The physical hunt was over, but the hunter was still sitting across from me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I was being audited by my own flesh and blood. Leo reached out and straightened the stolen phone on the table, a perfectionist's habit that felt like a warning. The Monroe County Sheriff will find them at the marina in exactly 18 minutes. I've already sent the geofence data and the high-def traffic cam shots to an anonymous tip line. I also included the serial numbers of the bills they are carrying. They are done, Dad. There's no way out for them. He stood up, slowly picked up his empty milk glass, and headed to the sink. The nightmare of the theft was being replaced by the cold reality of the strategist. Leo had untangled a complex criminal web in real time, and the way he spoke about it, calm, detached, clinical, was the most haunting part of the entire ordeal. He didn't see people. He saw protocols, vulnerabilities, and outcomes. My son was no longer just a boy who needed my guidance. He was a force of nature that had decided for this moment that I was a variable worth saving. But as I watched him rinse the glass and place it perfectly in the drying rack, I couldn't help but wonder what would happen on the day I became the variable he decided was no longer efficient. He was light years ahead, moving through a reality I couldn't even perceive, and I was just a man trying to remember how to breathe in a house that was now full of his secrets. The air felt thin, and the silence between us was no longer a comfort. It was a boundary. He had won the war, but I felt like I had lost my son to the very shadows he used to save us. Every line of code he wrote was a brick in a wall he was building around himself, a wall I didn't know how to climb. He was the protector now, and I was the one who needed to be handled. As he walked past me to go back to his room, he patted my shoulder, a gesture of comfort that felt terrifyingly patronizing. "Go to sleep, Dad," he said softly. "The money will be back in the morning. Everything is back where it belongs." But as the door to his room clicked shut, I knew nothing would ever be in its right place again. The $142,500 was coming home, but the boy who believed in the simple goodness of the world was gone forever, replaced by a master of the endgame who was just getting started. The silence of the house was shattered not by a siren, but by a revelation that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. As I sat in the flickering blue light of the kitchen, I began to realize that the digital trail Leo had so expertly followed wasn't just a map of Caleb's. Greet it was a blueprint Leo himself had drafted. I reopened the laptop, my fingers trembling as I bypassed the simple guest login Leo had left active. Deep within a hidden directory buried under layers of school assignments and game files, I found a folder titled Project Monarch. Inside were the raw files of a deepfake audio engine. I clicked the most recent export, and my own voice filled the room, perfect and terrifyingly precise. Yes, this is Elias Thorne. I need to authorize an emergency wire transfer of $142,500 to my brother's secondary account for a real estate closing. Bypass the standard hold. My breath hitched. Caleb hadn't stolen the money. He had been invited to take it. Leo had used my own voice to orchestrate the transfer, ensuring the bank's security would see it as a legitimate request from the account holder. He had handed the keys to Caleb like a baited trap, knowing his uncle's desperation and Sky's greed would do the rest. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the solar plexus. My 12-year-old son hadn't just reacted to a crime, he had manufactured one. He had broken Caleb by giving him exactly what he wanted, then filming every second of the downfall to ensure he could never come back. This wasn't just about the $142,500 anymore. It was about an internal bank segment breach that Leo had facilitated to make the theft look like a professional hack. He had exploited a misconfigured portal that he himself had created by sending a spear phishing link to that low-level clerk weeks ago acting as a bank IT administrator. Caleb was a pawn, a clumsy thief, walking into a high-tech slaughterhouse designed by a child. Leo had needed a villain to justify his own emergence as the protector. He had sacrificed his uncle's freedom and my peace of mind to test his own power. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me. Every "I handled it" and every "Don't worry, Dad" was a scripted line in a play where I was the only audience member who didn't know the plot. I scrolled further into the logs and found a series of encrypted chats between a user named L. Arch and an anonymous contact in the Monroe County jail system. Leo hadn't just tipped off the police. He had coordinated with associates inside the prison to ensure Caleb's arrival wouldn't be peaceful. Subject arriving tonight. Needs a reminder that Thorne assets are off limits. Make it loud, the message read. My son, the boy who still slept with a nightlight until 2 years ago, was ordering hits from the dinner table. The $142,500 wasn't the prize. It was the bait for a much larger game of total control. He had eliminated the black sheep of the family, secured our finances, and effectively neutered my authority, all while maintaining the mask of a devoted genius son. The weight of the betrayal shifted from my brother to my child. Caleb was a thief, but Leo was an architect of ruin. He had bypassed the morality of the world because he found it inefficient. "Family is what you protect, not what you forgive," he had written. I now understood that protect meant to own, and forgive was a weakness he couldn't afford. I looked at the kitchen knife Leo had used earlier sitting clean and sharp in the rack. The accident of it falling felt like a rehearsal. I was trapped in a house with a strategist who had no limit, a child who had hacked the very concept of family. The money was returning, but the cost was my soul. I was no longer a father, I was a witness to the birth of a monster. I closed the laptop, the click sounding like a gavel. The first belie twist was complete. I wasn't being saved by a hero. I was being managed by a mastermind who had staged the entire tragedy for his own evolution. The air in Naples was still humid, still heavy, but now it felt like the breath of a predator waiting for me to make my next move. I was the king on the board, and Leo had just whispered, "Check." The phone rang at 3:14 a.m., a jagged digital scream that tore through the suffocating silence of the kitchen in Naples. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the glass like a soldier over a landmine. It was an encrypted VoIP line, the kind used by high-stakes legal firms or maximum security facilities. I answered, and the voice on the other end wasn't the sandpaper rasp of a broken criminal. It was a cold, calculated whisper that sounded exactly like the ghost of my own conscience. It was Caleb, but he wasn't screaming for mercy. He was mourning. "Elias, listen to me very carefully because they're watching the logs. I didn't take that money to run, bro. I took it because she told me you were in a death spiral. She showed me proof that your accounts were being drained from the inside by a ghost entity. I was trying to move the assets to a cold wallet to save your retirement before the glitch wiped us out completely. The irony was a physical weight, a crushing pressure in my chest. My brother, the lifelong screw-up and family disappointment, had actually been trying to play the secret hero manipulated by a 12-year-old boy who knew exactly which psychological triggers to pull to activate Caleb's dormant protective instincts. Leo hadn't just watched the theft, he had engineered the motivation for it. Elias is not just a kid. Caleb choked out his voice, cracking under the weight of a terror I now shared in every fiber of my being. The anonymous report that put me in this cell, it didn't just have GPS data and timestamps, it had a full clinical psychological profile of my every weakness. It had a list of my priors from when I was 19, records that were supposed to be expunged, things even you didn't know about Elias. Someone has been building a federal-grade case against me since the very hour I moved into your guest suite. He wasn't hosting me. He was cataloging me for disposal. Oh, I felt the room tilt, the expensive marble floor becoming a slick, unstable surface. Caleb wasn't just a thief. He was a scapegoat in a much larger, darker narrative. Leo hadn't just caught a criminal. He had manufactured a villain out of a man who was finally, clumsily trying to do something right. They jumped me in the intake cell, Elias. Caleb whispered, the sound of his breath hitching as if he were looking over his shoulder, even in the dark. It wasn't a random jailhouse hit, it was timed. It was planned. They didn't want the money. They told me to keep my mouth shut about the architect. They said if I breathed a single word about the digital trails or the deepfake calls, you'd be the next one to have an unfortunate accident at the top of the stairs. He's cleaning the slate, Elias. He's removing anyone who can see through the mask. I looked toward the hallway, toward the closed door, where my son lay sleeping or perhaps sitting in the dark, monitoring the very signal I was speaking on. The realization was a blade cold and serrated. Leo hadn't just protected the family, he had seized it by the throat. He had removed the only other adult male in the house, the only person with enough shared history to notice the subtle chilling patterns of a burgeoning sociopath. Caleb was the black sheep because Leo needed a shadow long enough to hide his own blinding, predatory light. "I'm hanging up, Caleb," I whispered, my voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a grave. "I can't help you. If I help you, I lose him. Or worse, he decides I'm a liability too." "Don't hang up," Caleb pleaded, his voice rising in a desperate final surge. "Look at the don't open email. Elias. Look at the metadata. He didn't write it for some distant future where he's gone. He wrote it as a tripwire. It's a test of your loyalty. Everything in that house is a test now. The food, the chores, the silence. You're not his father anymore, Elias. You're his project. You're the asset he's decided to manage." The line clicked dead, replaced by a hollow electronic hum that sounded like a flatline in a morgue. I stood up my legs, feeling like they belonged to a stranger, heavy and unresponsive. I walked to the wall safe, my fingers fumbling with the dial in the dark. Inside, the letter to Uncle Caleb sat like a live coal in the shadows. I read the last line again, the words searing into my retinas. "You tied your own noose when you forged Dad's name." The ink was still fresh, the pressure of the pen so aggressive it had nearly torn the parchment. Leo hadn't been defending my honor. He had been punishing Caleb for the sheer audacity of trying to interfere with Leo's absolute management of our lives. Caleb had tried to save the money, but in doing so he had threatened Leo's control over the narrative. And in Leo's world, there was no room for two protectors. The air in the office felt thin, depleted of oxygen, as if the house itself were breathing for me. I realized then that my brother's warnings weren't the desperate, frantic lies of a cornered convict. They were the last rites of a man who had stared into the abyss and realized the abyss was wearing a middle school hoodie and eating cereal at his kitchen table. I was the last person who still might have the power to help Caleb, but I was also the only person left for Leo to dominate. The silence in the house was no longer a comfort, it was a siege. I was a father, caught between a love that felt like a carefully constructed lie and a suspicion that felt like a death sentence. I looked at the computer monitor, the blue light reflecting in my wide, staring eyes, and I knew that every move I made from this moment on was being recorded, analyzed, and filed away by the child I had raised. Caleb was physically in a jail cell in Monroe County, but I was the one in a psychological cage with no bars built of bits, bytes, and blood. The $142,500 was a pittance, a small price to pay for the terrifying clarity that I was no longer the master of my own fate or the king of my own castle. I was a king on a chessboard, immobile and useless, while my pawn had just promoted himself to a queen, standing directly in my path with a smile that never reached his eyes. As I turned off the office light, I realized the darkness didn't come from the room. It came from the hallway where I could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a 12-year-old steady breathing. He was waiting. He was always waiting. The house stilled into a fragile artificial quiet as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds of my office in Naples, Florida. The $142,500 was technically back, or at least its digital ghost was hovering in a secure holding account Leo had created. But the air in the room felt depleted of oxygen. My mother Evelyn arrived at exactly 7:00 a.m. She didn't knock. She had a key, and she moved through the hallway with a mask of fierce, unyielding devotion that I had never truly questioned until this very moment. She didn't ask about the police, the forged signatures, or the middle-of-the-night phone calls from jail. She went straight to Leo's room, her hand resting on his shoulder with a proprietary warmth that made my skin crawl with a new kind of dread. "Don't you dare drag my grandson into your mess, Elias," she whispered, her voice cutting through the morning hum like a sharpened blade. Caleb was always a cancer to this family. Leo is the only one who had the strength to cut it out. He is the light we have left. Her words were final, a chilling benediction for the strategist I was realizing we had both raised in the shadows of our own neglect. I stood in the doorway, caught between the mother who saw a savior and the brother in a cell who saw a predator. I felt the foundations of my life, my sense of being a father, a protector, a man of logic, dissolve into a fine, bitter ash. Evelyn wasn't just defending Leo, she was worshipping the efficiency he had displayed. To her, the morality of his methods was irrelevant because the outcome favored the Thorne legacy. She looked at me with a pitying glance as if I were a wounded animal that didn't realize it had been placed in a cage for its own good. I walked to the dining room where a chessboard sat perfectly arranged on the mahogany table. It wasn't a game in progress, it was a manifesto. The white king-me piece, I realized, was trapped in the far corner, every possible square of escape sealed by a wall of black pawns that had been systematically promoted to queens. Leo sat at the head of the table, the rising Florida sun catching the golden flecks in his eyes, making them look metallic and inhumanly bright. "Endgames are the most honest part of the process, Dad," he said, softly, his voice devoid of any lingering childhood innocence. "Family is what you protect, not what you forgive. Uncle Caleb was a leak in our system. I didn't destroy him, I just plugged the hole." He reached out and tipped the white king over with a single deliberate finger. The sound of the wooden piece hitting the board echoed like a gunshot in the silent house, marking the end of my reign as the head of the household. I retreated to my office, the safe still standing open like a gaping wound. I pulled out the laptop one last time, my hand hovering over the trackpad, trembling as I stared at the draft in the inbox, "Don't open unless I'm gone." I realized then that gone didn't mean Leo leaving the house or some tragic accident. It meant the version of Leo with "I loved the boy who liked Sunday pancakes, played catch in the yard, and watched superhero movies with wide-eyed wonder" was officially dead. He had been replaced by a master of the endgame, a child who had hacked the very concept of familial love to ensure his own total control. I didn't click the email. I couldn't. I was a coward wrapped in the skin of a father, choosing the suffocating safety of a lie over the total evisceration of the truth. I deleted the draft, watching the pixels vanish into the digital void, and with them my last chance to truly know the depths of the son I was now terrified of. Outside, the world began its mundane, sunny routine, as if nothing had shifted on its axis. Leo was back in the kitchen humming a popular song as he flipped pancakes on the griddle, the image of domestic perfection. My mother sat on the patio in the humid air sipping expensive coffee and praising Leo's brilliance to the neighbors over the fence, her voice full of a pride that sounded like a threat. I took a bite of the food Leo offered me, but it tasted like dry earth and iron. As Leo leaned over to hand me the maple syrup, a steak knife slipped from the tray and struck the porcelain tiles with a high-ringing note that seemed to split the morning wide open. We both froze. The sound vibrated in my teeth. Leo bent down with practiced grace, picked up the blade by the handle, and looked me dead in the eye. His smile was warm, practiced, and perfectly symmetrical, but his gaze was as cold and crushing as a deep-sea trench. "Careful, Dad," he whispered, his breath smelling of blueberries and milk. "We wouldn't want anyone else getting hurt, would we? Especially not now that everything is finally back in its place." I had chosen silence, calling it protection, but as I looked at my mother's radiant face and my son's calculating eyes, I knew I had actually signed a document of total surrender. The $142,500 was back in the account, the thief was behind bars, and the hero was serving breakfast. But the king on the board was still cornered, and I finally understood that in this house I wasn't the player anymore, I was the prize. The game hadn't ended with Caleb's arrest. It had simply moved into a permanent phase where the rules were written in a language of code and shadows that I would never be allowed to speak. I sat there forced to smile back at my son while the echo of that falling knife continued to ring in my ears, a permanent rhythmic reminder that the truths we refuse to face are the very ones that eventually bury us alive. I was a father to a stranger, a witness to a transformation I had facilitated by being too blind to see. And as Leo turned back to the stove, whistling a tune, I realized the most terrifying part of all. I was relieved that he was on my side, even if that side no longer felt like home. The Sunday sun in Naples was blinding, a brilliant white light that seemed to bleach the truth out of the world. I stood by the oversized Weber grill on the patio, the scent of charcoal and hickory wood smoke filling the humid air. On the griddle, a massive slab of smoked brisket sat glistening under a dark, peppery crust. It was the American dream, rendered in meat and fire. Beside me, Leo was humming a light, upbeat tune, his small hands expertly preparing the homemade slaw as if the events of the past week were nothing more than a forgotten school project. I took the long carving knife, its edge honed to a surgical sharpness. As I pressed the blade into the tender brisket, the crust gave way with a distinct rhythmic crunch-crunch sound. A sickeningly wet slicing noise that resonated through the metal tongs and directly into my bones. The sound of the knife fiberizing the meat was perfectly synchronized with the thudding of my own heart, thump slice, thump slice. Leo looked up, his face radiant and clear, his smile as wide and innocent as a child's on Christmas morning. "Looks perfect, Dad," he said, his golden eyes reflecting the leaping orange flames of the grill. I looked at the knife, then at his small, steady hands, and then at the vacant space where my brother used to sit. The SNST sound of the blade through the meat felt like it was cutting through my own chest. My mother laughed from the table, toast in hand, praising Leo's protective nature to a neighbor over the fence. I forced a smile, but my throat was tight with the taste of ash. Every slice of the brisket felt like a tactical move on a board I could no longer see. The peaceful BBQ was a stage, the smoke was a veil, and my son was the only one who knew how the play truly ended. I handed him a plate, my hand trembling slightly while his remained as steady as a surgeon's. We were a family again, but as the knife hit the platter with a final metallic ring, I realized I wasn't the master of the house. I was just another guest at Leo's table.